So, was the sixth flight test of the SpaceX Starship and Super Heavy system a success, despite the Super Heavy booster not having been caught this time? Do we have any details on why the booster wasn't caught? Was the flight otherwise a success? And what does the flight mean for the future timeline of the SpaceX Starship and Super Heavy development and for those Moon and Mars bases that we all want? So let's talk about the sixth ever flight test of the SpaceX Starship and Super Heavy. The Starship took off at around 4 p.m. CT time, and by now, after having witnessed 5 prior launches before that one here, we might convince ourselves that we have already gotten used to see this massive beast of a rocket take off. But in reality, we haven't. Every single time, it remains insane that a 121-meter tall rocket with a thrust of 16 million pounds, twice that of the legendary Saturn V moon rocket, and with a total weight of around 5,000 metric tons fully fueled up, that something so massive can take off with such apparent ease. Every single time. Majestic and beautiful to watch. Now, before we go on, what were actually the core objectives of this sixth flight test of the SpaceX Starship? What would have been needed to call the flight a full success? Well, these were the 4 objectives. 1. A restart of the Raptor engines in vacuum. 2. A daylight landing of the ship. 3. A steeper re-entry and thus a higher peak heating. 4. A faster and harder booster catch. Now, everything went nominally after the launch. No engine failures, nothing out of the ordinary, a picture-perfect launch as we would have expected it. After minute 2 and 36 seconds, the Super Heavy booster separated from the Starship as intended. Initially, the booster was still on for a catch by the launch tower's chopstick arms, as we had seen in the previous flight. But at minute 3:59, after the successful hot stage separation of the Super Heavy from the Starship, we heard a voice saying "booster offshore divert," meaning that the catching of the booster by the launch tower was cancelled. To be more precise, during the booster's return to the launch site, automated health checks of critical hardware on the launch and catch tower itself triggered an abort of the catch attempt, according to SpaceX. So the problem was not the booster, but the launch tower and the catching mechanism itself. What exactly the problem was, I think we're going to find out very soon. But it's at least good to know that the problem wasn't the Super Heavy booster itself. So after the catching then was a no-go, the Super Heavy diverted and landed beautifully in a picture-perfect vertical condition in the Gulf of Mexico. Incredible to watch. Starship, meanwhile, was on its way to somewhere in the Indian Ocean, northwest of Australia. Now, what was different in this flight was that while coasting in space, Starship successfully reignited a single Raptor engine, thus demonstrating, in SpaceX's words, the capabilities required to conduct a ship deorbit burn, which is a necessary prerequisite for starting full orbital missions. After around 35 minutes, Starship then slowly prepared for atmospheric re-entry. This time though, Starship went in at a more aggressive angle, thus creating more heat stress onto the heat shield tiles just to see how much they can take and if the design changes and improvements from over the last flights would have any effect. And indeed they did, because this time we could see hardly any burn through whatsoever near the flaps, something that was still a big problem in Flight 4 and still a bit visible on Flight 5. But this time, despite the more aggressive re-entry angle and thus higher speeds and friction, there was hardly any burn through visible. By the way, the only reason that we were even able to see all this happening in real time was due to Starlink. The Starship was outfitted with a Starlink communication system, thus allowing real-time data transmission to the Starlink satellites. Else we wouldn't be able to see such impressive images from a re-entry burn. To make it even crazier, this Starship here, as we could hear during the re-entry procedure by the people at SpaceX, had 2,100 less heat shield tiles than the previous ship. And so despite all these things, it is extremely impressive that there was no burn-through. Although we could see at the 1 hour mark and a few seconds that a section of the flap was glowing red from the heat. But as they said, this was done on purpose to collect data as to where the ship needs more heat shield tiles and where not. But even so, the flaps performed perfectly this time. Much better than the last times, despite all the stress tests, despite the steeper angle, despite less heat shield tiles. Amazing! As we can see now, another thing that was quite different from the last flights was that Starship actually would attempt a soft landing on water in daylight, quite contrary to the last times when it happened at night. We can see in this fascinating perspective here that the flaps were still working perfectly fine after re-entry. Also, the angle of Starship was steeper than last time, again to stress test the aft flaps as strongly as possible in order to gather more data on the maximum stress that the flaps can take. We could then see the center 3 Raptor engines igniting for that final landing maneuver in order to bring Starship into a vertical position. And due to the daylight, we could now this time see Starship in its full glory from a nearby buoy, how it came down perfectly at the right angle and at the right speed, thus confirming that Starship would have indeed been ready to land even on land, and therefore allowing for Starship to be caught by the launch tower maybe already in the next flight or the one after that. So then, the question now is, was Flight 6 a success? Let's go through the core objectives and see how many we hit. 1. Restart of Raptor engines in vacuum. Well, as we said, Starship successfully tested a single Raptor engine in vacuum for the first time ever, so this was indeed a success. 2. Daylight landing of the ship. Starship did indeed perform a perfect vertical landing at exactly the right speed and the right angle. 3. A higher peak heating and a steeper re-entry. As we said, Starship came in at a steeper re-entry angle and thus had to endure a higher peak heating. And despite that, it still performed flawlessly with no burn through at the flaps. 4. A faster, harder booster catch. Well, that one did not happen since an abort triggered from the launch tower itself for reasons that I'm sure we're going to find out in the coming days. So to sum it up, 3 out of the 4 objectives were met. The only one that was not met was the catching of the booster, but since SpaceX already managed to do that once before, we can be quite sure that they will be able to do so again very soon, possibly already in the next flight. And as some of you might remember, in Flight 5, the booster came also quite close to being a no-go for a catch. It came within 5 seconds of an abort, and SpaceX actually got quite lucky that the catch attempt happened at all in Flight 5. So all in all, I would therefore say that the flight was a huge success. Sure, the catching of the booster would have made it an overwhelming success, but meeting 3 out of the 4 objectives, I would say, is already quite amazing. And let's not forget that any other company or even country on Earth would not be able to even meet 1 out of these 4 criteria, since they are all so far away from having something that comes even remotely close to the Starship and the Super Heavy system. Even China is at least 10 years away from successfully cloning their own Starship, which they are, by the way, planning to do. I talked about it in this video here. And let's not even talk about Boeing and the likes. I mean, they wish they would have something even remotely as good and working. Anyway, so we can already now look forward to Flight 7, which insanely might even take place still this year in December, or if not, then in January 2025 at the latest. Wonderful time in which we live to now see so many Starship flights, and hopefully, thanks to deregulation under the new administration, we're going to see, hopefully, an even higher launch frequency of Starship in 2025. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe, since we will continue putting out lots of videos on fascinating technological developments in human spaceflight, but also in other interesting areas of technology. And please consider supporting us on Patreon or via a YouTube membership, because this would allow us to make more and higher quality videos. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day wherever you are, and see you next time.